You've been told that hitting a six-figure salary is the ultimate American dream. That is a lie. Let's run the real math on a $100,000 paycheck. Before that money even hits your direct deposit, the system eats it alive. Federal tax takes roughly $14,700 right off the top. Social Security and Medicare swipe another $7,650. If you live in a state like California or New York, say goodbye to another $5,500. You haven't spent a single dime yet, but $28,000. For nearly 28% of your life's energy, it's gone instantly. You feel squeezed because every dollar you earn is visible. Now compare that to the top 0.01%. Investigative reports show that in some years, billionaires paid an effective federal tax rate of just 3.4%, while their wealth grew by billions. They aren't hiding money in the Caymans. They simply understand the one rule you don't: how to make money invisible. If you want to understand the math that corporate hire departments and school systems strictly avoid teaching you, subscribe to the channel right now, because today we are going to rewrite the rulebook on how wealth is actually built. I'm not here to sell you a $997 course on drop shipping, and I'm certainly not going to tell you to save money by cutting out your $6 morning latte. That is poverty math. We need to be brutally honest about the structural trap of the W-2 employee. Standard advice tells you to work hard, get a 3% raise, and save 10% bong. But here's the problem. Real inflation has been running between 3% and 4%. If your company gives you a standard 3% cost of living adjustment, you aren't getting richer. Mathematically, you are just standing still. The system is designed to tax income, the money you trade your time for, at the highest possible rates. As long as your wealth comes from a salary, you are swimming upstream against the current of tax and inflation that moves faster than you can swim. The wealthy don't play this game. They don't try to earn more income. Instead, they focus entirely on a strategy called buy, borrow, D. It sounds dark, but it is the most tax-efficient loop in the US legal code. To escape the squeeze, you have to stop thinking like a worker and start acting like an owner. And that starts with the very first decision you make with your money. It starts with the buy phase. But they aren't buying cars or gadgets. They are buying the only thing that the IRS legally ignores. Let me show you the difference. This brings us to the first step, the buy. Most of us are trained to trade time for money. You work an hour, you get paid an hour. The problem is that the moment you trade time for a paycheck, you trigger a taxable event. The IRS has a direct line to your payroll department. Your money is loud. It screams for attention. The wealthy make a fundamentally different choice. They don't want income. They want assets. Specific assets that grow without paying dividends, but growth, stocks, private equity, or real estate in high appreciation markets. Let's look at the math on a $10,000 gain to see how unfair this really is. Imagine you crush it at work this quarter and your boss writes you a $10,000 bonus check because that is W-2 income. It hits your top marginal tax bracket immediately. Federal taxes snatch about $2,800 right off the top. If you live in a state like New York or California, the state takes another $900. Then FICA takes its cut of $765. By the time that money actually hits your bank account, your $10,000 bonus has shrunk to just $5,500. The system effectively penalized you for working harder. Now compare that to a wealthy investor who owns $100,000 in Amazon stock. If the stock goes up 10% this year, they just made the exact same $10,000. But here's the difference. Zero tax. Nothing comes out, no withholding, no reporting. Why? Because in the US tax code, growth is not income. It is called unrealized gains. As long as they don't sell the stock, that money effectively doesn't exist to the government. This is how the gap widens. You are running a race with a 40% weight strapped to your ankles, while they are running freely. They are compounding their entire gain, while you are only compounding what's left after the government takes its cut. Ask yourself right now. Look at your last pay stub. How much loud money did you lose to taxes before you even paid your rent? Put that number in the comments. It's usually painful to see it written down. But there is an obvious problem here. You can't pay for groceries with unrealized gains. Whole Foods doesn't accept Amazon stock certificates at the register. So, if the wealthy never sell their assets to get cash, how do they actually pay for their mansions and lifestyle? They borrow. This brings us to the second phase, and this is where the strategy shifts from being smart to being mathematically unfair for the average person. It is called the borrow. You see, if you or I want money, we usually have to sell something, our time, labor, or our stuff. And as we establish, selling triggers taxes. The wealthy have found a backdoor to access their liquidity without ever triggering a sale. Once you own large stable assets like the Amazon stock we just discussed, banks stop treating you like a risky employee and start treating you like gold-plated collateral. They offer you a specialized product called Securities-Based Lending or asset-backed lines of credit. This is not like begging for a mortgage where a loan officer scrutinizes your pay stubs and credit score. This is a streamlined line of credit secured directly by your portfolio. Major banks will happily lend you 50% to 70% of your portfolio's value in cash, often within days. But here is the magic trick that makes this legal. Debt is not income. Under the current tax code, the IRS does not tax loans because loans are a liability that must technically be paid back. So if a wealthy investor borrows $1 million against their stock portfolio to buy a vacation home or fund their lifestyle, that $1 million hits their bank account completely tax-free. They have all the purchasing power of a high earner with absolutely none of the tax drag. Now, the obvious objection is the interest rate. You might be thinking, isn't borrowing expensive? Wouldn't the interest eat up their wealth? For you, borrowing is expensive because you are likely paying 24% ARP on a credit card or 7% on a mortgage. That is, consumer debt. The wealthy carry strategic debt. In the current market, interest rates on these secured loans are often significantly lower, typically falling in the 6% to 7% range, depending on the size of the relationship. This creates a phenomenon called positive arbitrage. Let's look at the math. If a portfolio is invested in the S&P 500, it historically grows at about 8% to 10% per year. If the loan costs them 6.5% in interest, they are still mathematically winning. The asset grows faster than the debt accumulates. Specifically, on a $1 million loan, the interest might cost $65,000, but the underlying assets backing that loan could grow by $80,000 to $100,000. They didn't just get a free lifestyle, they effectively got richer while spending the money. This works because the system rewards scale. At $1 million in assets, you get good rates at $10 million. Borrowing becomes cheaper than earning, while the middle class sells their time to pay off expensive debt. The ultra-wealthy use cheap debt to buy time. The spread between the cost of their loan and the growth of their assets is what funds their entire existence, allowing them to never sell, never report income, and never pay the IRS. However, this house of cards relies on one dangerous assumption, that the market keeps going up. If stocks crash, the bank calls the loan and everything can collapse. So, how do they ensure they never have to pay the piper? They wait for the final step. To see how this actually plays out in real life, we need to run the numbers on a human being, not just a textbook theory. Let's look at David. David isn't a tech billionaire or a celebrity. He is a business owner who spent decades building wealth the boring way. By his mid-50s, his net worth sits around $4 million, mostly tied up in stocks and real estate. He wants to retire. Most people assume the next step is obvious. You sell your assets when you need money. But let's look at the financial violence of that decision. If David decides to liquidate just half his portfolio, about $2 million, to fund his retirement over the next decade, he triggers a massive taxable event. Between the 20% federal long-term capital gains rate and state taxes, he is looking at losing $400,000 to $500,000 instantly. That is, $500,000 that disappears into the government's pocket. It never compounds again. It never grows again. It is simply gone. Now, let's run the buy, borrow, defraze. Instead of selling, David calls his private bank. Because he has $4 million in stable assets, the bank offers him a 65% loan-to-value line of credit. This gives him access to $2.6 million in liquidity without selling a single share. The interest rate is 6.5%. Here's where the math gets interesting. If David draws on the loan, he pays roughly $169,000 a year in interest. But at the same time, his $4 million portfolio stays invested. If it earns a conservative 7% annually, it grows by $280,000 in that same year. Do you see the gap? The assets grow by $280,000. The loan costs $169,000. The difference is $111,000. David is effectively covering his living expenses and the cost of the loan purely through asset growth, all while his principal remains untouched. And the best part, the IRF, see zero income, no W-2, no 1099. On paper, David is technically poor. This pattern repeats year after year. Some years the market is down, some years it is up, but David never has to sell a large chunk of his empire just to pay a tax bill. But the critics always ask, what happens when the bill comes due? What about all that debt? That brings us to the final, and frankly, the most controversial step of the strategy. The die. Fast forward 25 years, David passes away. Even with conservative growth and regular borrowing, his portfolio is now worth around $9 million. He also accumulated an outstanding loan balance of roughly $3 million to fund his lifestyle. In a normal world, you would expect a massive tax bill on that growth, but under current US tax law, specifically Section 1014 of the Internal Revenue Code, David's assets receive a stepped-up basis. The moment David dies, the original cost of his assets is erased. The assets are revalued at their current market price. The $5 million or $6 million in growth that occurred over his lifetime, the capital gains tax on that growth simply vanishes. It is as if the growth never happened for tax purposes. David's heirs can then sell $3 million worth of stock to pay off the bank loan immediately. Because the cost basis was just reset, they owe zero capital gains tax on that sale. The debt is settled, the bank is happy, and the remaining $6 million passes to his children, tax-free and fully intact. Compare that to the traditional path. If David had sold assets gradually over those 25 years, millions of dollars would have been siphoned off to taxes, killing his compound interest. His ending balance would have been dramatically smaller. The difference wasn't intelligence. It wasn't risk tolerance. It was simply knowing which kind of money the tax system recognizes as real and which kind it chooses to ignore. To fully grasp the magnitude of this strategy, we have to isolate the final rule. It is called the stepped-up basis, and it is arguably the most powerful wealth transfer tool in history. It essentially makes capital gains tax optional for the ultra-wealthy. Let's run a pure numbers example to see the mechanics clearly. Imagine an investor buys a piece of land or a block of stock for $1 million back in the 1980s, over 40 years. That asset explodes in value by the time they pass away. That same asset is worth $10 million. That represents a $9 million profit. If they had sold that asset the day before they died, the IRF would have demanded roughly $2 million in federal and state capital gains taxes. That is a massive hit. But because they held it until death, the tax code performs a magic trick. The moment the investor dies, the cost basis of the asset is stepped up from the original $1 million to the current $10 million market value. The $9 million gain simply vanishes from the tax record. It is erased. This means the heirs can turn around and sell that asset the very next day for $10 million and pay $0 in capital gains tax. This is not a loophole. It is a gift written directly into the rules. This mechanism is why the buy, borrow, loop works. The debt funds the lie still and deftly lits the tax bill, but before you rush to the bank to try this, there is a catch. The obvious question is, if this is legal, why doesn't everyone do it? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. You aren't rich enough yet. This strategy relies on asset-backed lending, and that is a velvet rope industry. It doesn't work for the middle class because the banking system treats you differently based on your net worth. If you walk into a bank with a regular paycheck, they demand proof of income, credit checks, and charge you high interest rates. But once you cross a specific threshold, the rules flip. Generally, you need about $1 million in investable assets, stocks, bonds, not your home equity, just to get a seat at the table where these loans are offered. At that level, the rates are decent, but the real magic happens at scale. At $5 million, the fees soften. At $10 million and above, banks start competing for your debt, pushing interest rates down to the bare minimum. The system literally rewards scale. A billionaire can borrow at a few percentage points above the benchmark rate, while a credit card borrower pays double digits. So when people ask, why don't more people do this? The reality is that you can't borrow cheaply unless you are already rich, and once you are, borrowing becomes easier and cheaper than earning. This leads us to the final TOE. The game wasn't broken, it was built this way. We spend our lives debating tax rates, whether the top bracket should be 37% or 39%, but we miss the point. Rates only matter for visible money, the money that shows up on a W-2 paycheck. The real divide in America isn't just rich versus poor, it is visible money versus invisible money. If you want to change your financial trajectory, you have to stop obsessing over higher salary and start obsessing over owning assets that the tax code favors. You cannot W-2 your way to freedom when the math is rigged against income. If this video made you angry, good. Use that energy. Share this video with someone who is still chasing a higher salary, thinking it will solve their problems. They need to see the math and watch this next video to understand exactly which assets you should be buying to start playing the game on your own terms.